Hello and welcome to the Paranormalist Podcast. I'm your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good today.
Me too. And that's
So,
all I have to say about that.
well, I think that this podcast episode is going to go in a really interesting direction. So we're going to try to finish out this two-parter and leave it as a two-parter. So very quickly, for anybody who didn't listen to the last one, I started out talking about a couple things. The first thing was that there were a couple events that occurred that very well could have literally torn the fabric of time or ripped open a dimension. The first one I talked about was the Philadelphia experiment. The second one was Jack Parsons. Now, Jack Parsons he started Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He was a scientist. His expertise was fuels and how to stabilize fuels, but he was also a devotee of Crowley, and he practiced sex magic. And he did a ritual called the Babylon Rising ritual. Since last week, somebody had sent me some documentation, and I checked it out. Apparently, after the UFO flap starts, the federal government reaches out to him because they knew about what he did, because they had generals working with him who literally walked into the middle of rituals. Can you imagine you're going out to the desert to talk to a scientist and he's sitting naked in a pentagram, chanting and having these kind of bizarre rituals going on, and the general's like, "What are you doing?" But they knew. So after this whole thing happened with the Babylon Rising, and he was found out in the desert naked, this would have been from January to March. It's a long ritual. They forced him out of the business, but they contact him and they said, "Hey, this thing you tried to do in the desert, is there any chance it ripped some sort of a hole so things can pass back and forth from dimensions?" And he's like, "Yeah, actually, that's a possibility. I don't know what it did. I know it did something." And so the government, even at that time, right after all of this stuff starts, has that thought. And there have been UFO stories from the beginning of time. There's paintings with them and stuff like that. There's a difference. Something changes. And we talked a little bit about that, about Maury Island, which is sort of a man named Harold Dahl, who was a captain of a little ship, and he and his crew witnessed these 9 donut-shaped UFOs, and it's night, and they are hovering above the Puget Sound in Washington, and one of them seems to be in ill repair. It spits out what he's described as looking like pieces of newspaper, but they were metal, they were hot. And later on, he would say they were hot as lava, and they fell on his ship. They burned his 15-year-old son's arm, killed the dog, and broke the arm of one of his seamen. And so the next day, he's really rattled. He seeks medical attention for the seaman and his son. He's really shaken. He has this medal. And the next day, as he's going out to his ship, he hasn't talked to anybody but the guys on the ship. And it's a small ship. There literally was a crew of about 4 people. And this man in black comes up to him, and this is the first time you ever hear of a man in black. There's no stories prior to this in the history of ufology. And the man in black this guy comes up in a black suit, and he seems to have materialized right there in front of him, like he doesn't see the guy coming. And he says, "Mr. Dahl, there's a diner down here at the end of the street. Why don't you and I take a little walk? We need to talk about what happened last night." And, Dahl looks up, he goes over, he's like, "Okay, okay, yeah." So he goes down, and the guy tells him everything that occurred. And what he says is, you need to understand that what you saw is something that you shouldn't have seen, and you need to keep your mouth shut. It would be a shame if something happened to somebody in your family. You just need to keep your mouth shut. This guy puts out this really scary vibe. Then he gets up, doesn't pay for anything. He doesn't eat anything. He orders a cup of coffee, but he doesn't even touch that. And he says to him as he's leaving, he looks back and he said, "I mean what I said. It'd be a real shame." Well, Dahl had lied to him and said he didn't have anything, but he had that one piece of metal that had fallen and burned his son's arm. And he's quiet. Now, meanwhile, 2 days later, Kenneth Arnold has his very first encounter. He's the guy who sees the 9 craft, interestingly enough, also 9 craft in the sky and out near Mount Rainier in Washington State, and he witnesses them, but he also ends up flying parallel to them. He estimates their size as the size of a military plane, and he lands and he says to a guy at the airport, "Hey, you're not going to believe what I think I saw." He tells the guy's like, "Man, you don't want to talk about that crap." But he does. He goes and he talks to a couple friends who are ex-military, and they're like, "Dude, we've seen stuff like that a couple times. Like, you don't want to talk about it." But he does. He goes and he does an interview. Somebody hears about it. They talk to him. He does an interview, makes it to the newspaper. Then he ends up doing a TV interview. And very quickly, he becomes the guy who gives the term flying saucers. He said that the things looked like pie pans skipping across the sky, and that became flying saucers. So now this is interesting. So the guy who runs Amazing Stories magazine hears about the Maury Island incident, and he knows Kenneth Arnold, and he reaches out and he says, "Hey," now Kenneth Arnold's a businessman, he's well thought of at the time, and he says, "Hey, you know that story about what happened out there in Maury Island?" And he fills him in on it and everything. He's like, "Why don't you go out and talk to this guy, because you're credible. He might give you the details." So Arnold doesn't want to do it, but he has a couple friends who are military guys, and he actually convinces them to go out and talk to Mr. Dahl and see what he can find out. And it's fascinating, because here's what happens. I'm gonna give you the exact information on who he was. So Arnold makes this arrangement to have these guys go out. They go out, they talk to Mr. Dahl. He tells them he had a couple pictures that he had shot when he first saw the things before everything went crazy and the hot stuff comes flying out of the missing craft and all of this. So that they go and they say, "Do you have any of it here?" And he's like, "Wait, I got one piece." And they're like, "Great, can we have it?" He's like, "Sure. And here's the photographs. Here's everything I got. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's something foreign. I'm not sure, but you got to do something." So on August the 1st of 1947, this B-25 bomber that these 2 military men were in, these 2 intelligence officers, they're both talking about what's going on. They're in the plane, they're headed back with the stuff. They're going to take it to their superiors, and the plane crashes outside of Kelso, Washington. Both men are dead on impact. The plane was in perfect working order when it lifted off that morning. It was stated that it was officially engine failure, but rumors swirled that the plane had been sabotaged to prevent anybody from getting the materials that they had on board that plane. The debris was carried off and was never brought forward ever again. It was just disposed of quickly. So after that, the FBI suddenly gets involved, and they say Dahl made it up because he wanted to sell a story. Now you have to understand, he's a harbor police officer. This is what he does for a living. He had no intention of selling a story, but they say he did. And the same guy who comes out and talks to him from the FBI ends up being the guy that starts Project Blue Book. And this is the official beginning of that. So, and anybody who doesn't know, Project Blue Book was really all about denying any plausibility for any UFO craft. So we did that, and then we started to talk about John Keel. John Keel was a professional journalist, and this would have been in the 1960s, and he is interested in the paranormal. He hears about something going on in West Virginia, which we now know as the Mothman Chronicles. For those of you who don't, he goes down, he makes contact with a lady named Mary Hyre, who's a journalist. She's writing for a local newspaper. And through her, he begins to visit people and talk to them and do research on what's going on down there. And he is very shocked by what he ends up finding out. She introduces him to an 18-year-old girl named Connie Carpenter. Now, Connie was she left church early on a Sunday evening. It was pretty early. It was still kind of twilighty. And on her way home, she sees the Mothman standing in a field. And she's sure this is what she saw. She goes home, and because she's related to the journalist, the local journalist, she tells her cousin, I believe she is. And that's when everything starts. The cousin begins to write about it because now there's been 4 teenage kids in a car who saw it, and the thing kept pace with them. A neighbor guy down the road saw it, and when his dog was whimpering and carrying on, and he went outside to see what was going on, and there it was sitting in a tree looking down at him. Multiple other people have now seen it. In total, in 13 months, there'll be 100 sightings. But one of the ones that John Keel's really interested in are the ones from Connie Carpenter, because she tells it a great story. But more importantly, after she starts talking to her cousin, the reporter, and after John Keel shows up, this young lady ends up being just harassed to the point of a nervous breakdown. The first thing that happens is suddenly she gets conjunctivitis in both of her eyes at the same time. Then there's these phone calls. Sometimes it's whirs and clicks and noises. Sometimes it's deep breathing, like somebody's on the other end of the line going. Sometimes it's mechanical beeps. Kind of like whenever anybody who's old enough to remember whenever you had the dial-up tone, that thing, you know what I'm talking about?
Absolutely.
And that would be that sound. But down in the 1960s, we didn't have dial-ups. So, that didn't make any sense. Sometimes it would be crazier stuff than that. So that's whenever the men in black start showing up for Connie. She would talk about these men in black. They had these very striking features, almost Eastern European, but not quite. And they would have these poorly fitted black suits, exotic kind of tone to their skin. They almost had disjointed, rehearsed vocal patterns, and they would use they would use things like colloquial slang, almost like if a person had learned English through watching old Westerns. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'll tell you what, partner. Kind of a thing. It was really odd and just jarring. And they would show up. Sometimes they'd have this really old car from the 1940s, and it would just literally materialize. Like they're sitting there looking out the window, there's nothing there, and then suddenly you look at the tree in the yard and you look back and there's this car and it's already parked. And these 2 men in these ill-fitting black suits with fedoras and glasses get out, and they come up to the door. In some instances, it looked like they had slits for mouths, and just like lipstick was painted on their faces. Their skin would be very white, waxy, pale, plastic looking almost. And they would come in and they would grill you about, you didn't see anything last night, did you? You better not tell people what's going on. There's a story further back in moving forward in time. There's a story of a man who was a radio show host, and he started getting phone calls about this. And he starts collecting the stories like on the phone, and he runs them on the radio show. Like, hey, we've had 4 more sightings. Here's what's going on. And a being very much the same description shows up at his house and says to him, I know you're alone. Your wife will be back in 20 minutes. It'd be a shame if she wouldn't be as pretty as she is right now. If you mention this one more time, that might have to happen. And then gets up and walks out. He got rid of everything, stopped doing it, quit his job, everything. So this is going on all the time. Then there's the threats, the over the phone threats, when there's phone calls and There's all these crazy threats going on. You know, if you talk again, your dog will be dead. If you talk again, something bad's going to happen. Be ashamed if something happened to your mom. That kind of stuff. And this went on and on and on. And it actually, when John Keel goes back home, it continues. The other phenomena that was really interesting to John Keel at the beginning was he and Connie are walking down the street and they see a man dressed like a man in black, but he's got a camera, an old-fashioned, like from the 1930s camera, and he's taking pictures of them walking. So he veers off and he goes towards this man, and this man looks at him kind of surprised that he's coming at him, and the man literally just stops and turns, and as he turns, he just fades away. And right in front of Keel and this girl, Connie. So there's another thing that they talked about would be static disruptions. Like you'd answer the phone and you'd have these really loud bursts of static. And it would just be really loud and going on and on and on. And back then, it doesn't make sense to people who have cell phones, but back then you could hang the phone up and then hit 0, or in that time frame, even pick up the phone, and it would be possible to get an operator and say to them, there's trouble on my line. Can you see if anybody's reported it? And they could say, oh yeah, there's a lot of problems on your line. 3 of your neighbors also reported it. But the operators couldn't find anything. So whatever it was localized to that particular phone. And this went on and on. Sometimes people would talk about these beings being 7 feet tall. They would talk about them having red eyes that would sometimes glow. Sometimes they would be gray. They could shift colors, just a lot of stuff. So this is the next case. Now, John Keel, he starts to formulate this idea that will be a big part of what I'm about to talk about. He starts to think these aren't aliens from outer space. They're intimidating, they're manipulative, they are paranormal. They are here, they're not here, they know things they shouldn't know. In one instance in West Virginia, a woman and her husband had a conversation about something that had occurred to them the night before. They had neither talked to any person. They had not been out of their house. And when the woman left the house that morning, she got to her front porch, and a being in black steps out of nowhere, like around the side of the steps, and says, this was what you talked about, and repeats word for word the conversation they had had early in the morning. And then tells her, if you tell anybody else what you and your husband were talking about, something really bad will happen to both of you. Like, it's verbatim, the entire conversation. And that brings us to something called ultra-terrestrials. Keel begins to posit that these things are interdimensional beings, not beings from outer space, that they are located on the earth, but on a slightly different dimension, and they're interacting with us, and they're controlling and manipulating us for purpose. He's not sure what all the purposes are. They seem to enjoy the chicanery. They love the fear. They make lots of threats. And in the book, The Mothman Prophecy, he doesn't talk about it so much this way, but in the movie, for those who saw the movie, it sounds like he believes that they came to warn them about the bridge. There's a bridge that will collapse, and that this was a kind of warning of it going to happen. But in the book, that is not how he describes it. He believes that it's kind of a culmination of all of the evil that they had perpetuated that causes this bridge in Parkersburg to collapse. It collapses, I believe it's like Christmas Eve, and there was 46 people on the bridge in cars when the bridge begins to collapse, and many of them didn't make it out. And so he begins this process. Now, there's a book he puts out in 1970 called UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse. And in this, he begins to flesh out his theory. He's collected a lot of stories, not just the ones in Point Pleasant, but he's now gone all across the country. He's interviewed lots of people. They're all telling the same crazy stories. And from it, he begins to argue. I'm going to use some of his language for it because I want it to make sense to everybody. He believes that these beings have been present throughout our history, that they are masquerading as the gods, like Baal and Lilith and all of these beings, that they are representing themselves as angels and demons and fairies and ghosts and all of the different, trolls and everything else, that they portray themselves differently throughout history to fit contemporary belief systems, but that they are eternally here and they manipulate us. They're outside of our space and time. They coexist with us, possessing the ability to cross into our reality at will. Then we're going to talk about another point we touched on last week, which is something called the Montauk Project. And this is where this gets even more dark. So the Montauk is a base outside of New York and on an island, and it's called Montauk Island, and it was an Air Force base, and then they built a whole complex under the ground. And it was speculation for a long time what was going on there. We do know that they were doing biological warfare there. We also know that that's most likely, and there are books by some very reputable doctors that indicate that Lyme's disease came from some of that research, that they put an underground base, and then you start hearing stories about the boys, the Montauk boys. These are kids running from 15 years old to about 8 who have been taken or who were in the foster care system, who end up on this island living in these bunkers underground, and they're used by the government to test moving from dimension to dimension. They found that the children had an easier time moving. They were more resilient to the effects. And as adults, 3 men would come forward and say they were Montauk boys. And there is research and there has been disclosures indicating that there was some such program on Montauk underground, and it was looking at interdimensional travel. And if you think that all sounds like a bunch of hooey hello, what do you think CERN is? It is trying to cause interdimensional travel. That's the point of this. So going down that route, I want to talk about some of the concepts that he noted. So among the concepts that Keel talks about is the fact that the government created something called the space brother hypothesis. And you're probably sitting here going, no, this is crazy. Like the 1950s and 60s and all the sci-fi and everything, it was always guys from outer space, right? That's what we saw in every movie, right? But what if there were government people who knew the truth and they were benefiting financially from these interdimensional beings? And so they create a psyop, simply, feeding videos and feeding storylines to movie companies and saying, hey, we'll help finance it. We'll help, we'll give you access to places where you can shoot it. Government's done that lots of times. You only have to look into the history between Hollywood and the government to see that they have played psyop games with us forever. So Keel says, I reject this, what he calls the space brother hypothesis, that UFOs are visitors from other planets. His investigation shows him, he says, that there's a link between UFOs and psychic and paranormal events, but not a technology or a physical one. So he's saying we're not getting technology and we're not seeing that. We're seeing paranormal events. He also calls the next concept the mask concept. He says these entities manipulate humanity by appearing in forms that fit the cultural expectations of that time. Fairies, spacemen today, demons, ghosts, whatever they are. and that these are controlled deceptions, that these ultra-terrestrials are intelligent and they stage events and have for centuries that propagate and reinforce certain erroneous religious beliefs, suggesting that at best they're mischievous, at worst they have malevolent intent. Now, you might say, oh, that's crazy. But I'm going to tell you, even though you didn't hear about it in the 1950s and 60s, starting in the 1960s, moving through the 70s till today, very high-level paranormal investigators and very high-level investigators in the ufology field have posited exactly the same thing in some fashion. And I'm going to take you through some of those because some of them are really interesting. So what attracted John Keel's attention were the men in black, because they're not real. They don't make sense. They drive in antiquated cars and they wear outdated clothing. And here's the interesting thing. Once people started talking about the cars being so outdated, and once people started saying about their clothing, they would adjust and correct. And the cars wouldn't be 1930s cars anymore. Now they're 1960s cars. The clothing would become modernized and better. The makeup was better. In one of the experiences with that young girl, Connie, one of these entities came to her house early on, and she would describe it like this. It came in, it sat down, it began to talk with her. She felt very afraid of it, and almost like she had no ability to say no when it said, I want to come inside. Sounds like Black-Eyed Children, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You need to let me in. We need to talk. And she's standing there, and it says sit. She sits, and it's talking to her. And as it's talking, it says, my energy is running down. I need to go right now. It stands up, and as it's talking, it gets much slower, as though the battery is dying. And it goes out quickly down toward where the car had been sitting that she had seen in the driveway, and the car becomes a point of light. And it merges into this point of light and is gone. So let's talk a little bit about, some of the things that have been going on. So we talked about John Keel and his theory and hypothesis on ultra-terrestrials, but he's not alone. Dr. Stephen Greer talks about the men in black being exactly that, ultra-terrestrials, spiritual beings that have been on this planet, dimensionally speaking, in and out of it, since the beginning of time. And that these beings manipulate people and correct history. I shouldn't say correct. I should say change history, change the narrative of history in such a way as to fit what they want. If they want people to be afraid, they want people to, stay out of an area, if they want people to think that an event had a certain impact, they'll do that. They'll simply change the narrative. And then we have Jacques Vallée. Now, he's a famous, he's extremely famous scientist who began collecting these kinds of stories on UFOs and what have you. You see him on TV all the time, and they edit him. So most of the time when they talk to Jacques Vallée, he will talk about beings and from altered dimensions and things like this. And people think he's talking about spacemen. He's not. In his writings, he will talk about these ultra-terrestrials over and over, many, many cases. We're going to touch on one of those. He had an associate named Amy Michael, and this person is also a French author. She's she's a ufologist. She worked with Vallée. She helped collect data with him. She also pushed the theory that UFOs are not simply physical machines from other planets, but rather interdimensional beings moving around, creating scenarios that change as the needs of the beings change. Author Brad Steiger, I think Brad wrote 100 and, maybe even a couple hundred books. He's a huge author. He did a lot of research into ufology. And what he talked about were the gods of the ancient astronaut theory. So basically, he started out with that theory, and then he said, as time went on, I am more and more convinced that these are non-physical interdimensional beings and not gods of ancient worlds coming here to interact with us. When he started talking about the cases, that changed things. Patrick Harpur is an author who wrote Demoniac Reality, and he argues that UFOs and the paranormal phenomena are manifestations of ultra-terrestrials or other world, other dimension intelligence. Jacques Berger wrote The Warning of the Magicians, and here's our next link. In this book, he wrote about the occult and interdimensional possibilities of this phenomena we know as Men in Black and UFOs. I'm going somewhere, guys. Raymond Palmer, he was, what would you call him, a pulp author, pulp fiction, or pulp nonfiction author. He wrote for things like Amazing Stories. And he was the editor of Amazing Stories for many years. In the 1940s and 50s, he collected tons and tons of stories in first-person accounts of these. And he became convinced that this was paranormal, that it bridged a gap between dimensions, possible hollow earth theories. That's where one of those came from. But whatever it wasn't meant from outer space. These are beings that have been playing with humanity for a long time. And you'll come across one of his most famous stories was called the Shaver Mystery, in which he posits that there are evil beings, subterranean beings, that use robots to create earthly misfortune and then link these to UFO ideas because we're easily compelled in that direction. Not to mention the fact that we're being pushed there by the media, the industry, the entertainment industry, and the government. I mean, did you honestly think that the government was ever going to come out and start talking about these tic-tac things? They're telling you about little lights popping around. They're not talking about people getting abducted. They're not talking about all of those kind of things that are going on. They want to keep it clean and antiseptic at this point. But we're going to continue. Later in his lifetime, Palmer would write The Real UFO Invasion in 1967, promoting the idea that he had begun to recognize that the government was covering up. So, like, he believed that there were these men in black beings that were interdimensional. He believed that the government then mimicked that to apply pressure when it was optimal to do so. There is a case in which the government drove a man to the brink of suicide. He lived near a military base, and he began to notice these weird lights in the middle of the night. He began to take photographs of them. Now, he worked for the military, and he went to his superiors, and he's like, hey, there's this really weird stuff going on, and I've got photographs and videos of it, and I don't know what it is. If it's like a government project, just say so, and I'll like back off and stop taking pictures. And they're like, oh, you're crazy. They hired 2 people who would later testify in court and later in Congress that they were hired to convince this man that they were aliens from outer space as men in black, and that everything that was happening to him was real, and to convince him that he was insane because what was going on in the military base, they didn't want him to know. Now, they didn't even say, hey, no, dude, it's just stuff that we can't unleash to the world yet. They paid 2 government agents to drive this man insane. I don't know about you, but I think that's a crazy ass story. So what are some of the cases that Jacques Vallée and others, John Keel did not die to 2009. So just so you know, thought might be very good examples of it. the Barney and Betty Hill abduction in 1961, the Rendlesham Forest in 1980, the Ariel school encounter in 1994, where over 60 children in Zimbabwe reported seeing a craft that communicated telepathically about environmental destruction, the Travis Walton abduction, and the Mothman prophecies. Now, I'm coming down to one particular person. His name is Nathaniel Gillis, and many of you probably have never heard of him. He is an author and a demonologist who lives in a rarefied world where he's working alongside priests and UFO investigators, and they're all headed in the same direction. I want you to understand this is probably the apex of all of this. So they chose these beings. They chose the Men in Black persona. I think they choose the Black-Eyed Children persona. I think they choose 1,000 different personas throughout time, each of them terrifying. But for what? Play head games with us? That's not what it is at all. They want to interact with us and mate with us. How many UFO stories have you heard where somebody was taken on board a craft and they were sexually examined, their sperm or their ovaries were penetrated and like eggs were removed or semen? How many stories of people who see beings, little babies that are half human and half not, and they're laid in the arms of the woman and she's told, this is your child? How many stories of crazy stuff like that have there been in the UFO community? A lot, right? Over the years. And we've all heard them. We've all read about them. They've done movies on some of them. Travis Walton being one of the experiences for that. Now, Nathaniel Gillis believes, and he has evidence to back up his belief, that these beings are what we call demonic entities, and that they interact with us to breed with us, and that they are using sex magic as a ritual to give themselves power over us. I want to tell you this crazy story. I know that you probably think I'm crazy already, but this is insane. There is a priest. Let me get down to him here in just a second so that I can, who began to work on, we would call them exorcisms of women who claim to have been violated by demons, by alien and, UFO creatures and what have you. I'm going to read this directly so that I don't mess it up. So just this quickly, I understood that the details and these women were showing that they were pregnant. So they went to these women go to priests and they say, I've had this alien encounter and I think I'm pregnant. I've had this demonic encounter and I think I'm pregnant. The first thing that the priests would do was make sure that they were actually pregnant. And he said, these women were showing the signs of being pregnant. Is this happening after getting pregnant in a normal sense with a male human being, and then some sort of interdimensional possession is happening to the fetus? Or is the fetus appearing to have some of the kind of interdimensional interaction? And he said, I have come to believe, based upon what I have learned from these priests, that it is the latter. That means the interdimensional interaction. That is why these exorcisms came to a conclusion and they were not impregnated anymore. Understand that. The priest did an exorcism and a person who was medically pregnant ceased to be medically pregnant. You ready? Okay. And that happened without any medical intervention. And then you start to understand that, yeah, possession to us is as pregnancy is to them. So when they possess us, they are literally looking at it as a short-term way for them to impregnate us with something. Now, I want you to go even further with me, because there's something that has been found. Okay? He talks about one of the priests began to notice that something called sigils were found on the bodies of every one of these people. Okay, now what's a sigil? Just so you understand. Sigils are symbolic representations of specific intentions, desires, or entities. They are designed to influence the reality by bypassing the conscious mind and activating the subconscious, rooted in the word signum, or sealed. They are signatures for spirits or personalized manifestations, often created through chaos magic or sex magic, condensing letters and removing the vowels. They have been used for thousands of years in magic. In the Lesser Key of Solomon, it is a form of ceremonial magic. These formulas they're called formulas, and they have an intent. They write a clear statement. They remove the vowels and any double consonants to make it less readable, but it still carries the intent. People do not understand that every letter you speak, every word you speak, carries intent. And in a spiritual realm, that intent continues to happen, even though you may not think about it again. They focus energy and emotion onto the sigil to connect it to its goal. Now, the act of launching the sigil is the intention into the subconscious achieved through gnosis, also called altered consciousness, or destroying the physical sigil, burning, burying, or tearing it. They are used, drawn, painted, carved onto objects, skin, paper for protection, attraction, or personal empowerment. The one priest he worked with, stated that he found sigils on every exorcised person, sometimes carved to the underside of their eyeballs or their eyelids, sometimes buried in their skin, but every one of them had sigils. So when these women are showing as pregnant, it's happening, and it's part of a ritual, a sex magic ritual. And so he says, when I came across this ritual with the sigils, then I found that it included some of these pathologies, everything that we've mentioned, the dream demon, the collocation with the victim, meaning the sex act with the victim, grooming a victim, picking the victim, and then marking the victim to procreate with them, creating a fetus as a new biological avatar for the bee. Listen to what I just said. I just said these beings need to climb into a body to move around on this planet. Badly constructed ones sometimes, maybe that's the Men in Black, but they're also using sex magic to create biological meat suits that they can enter. So their reason that they need us, the reason they interact with us, is because they require something that we can give them, they can't give themselves. We can birth, and they cannot. It's called a cult transference when this occurs. And I do believe, again, that whatever these species are, they are not horns and hooves. They are practitioners, and that's also why Siriasti of Amino, that's the priest he worked with, said right out that I am not just finding secretions, I'm finding sigils. So the priest was finding that these people had biological secretions, male sperm of some sort on them after the event that could be removed and looked at. But it would be not just on their genital area, but on their body in other places. And it would return over and over, even when they were under observation. So understand, they have a nun sitting in a room watching the lady sleep. And when she awakens, she rolls over and there's something on her stomach that's damp and wet. She pulls up her nightgown to show the nun or the nurse or whoever, and they take a sample, and it's the same thing that was on her before, and it can be genetically, looked at. It's the same thing. Now they're finding that, and now the priest has been finding sigils. He said, and I am finding sigils with them, and so that implies that the presence of a practitioner, some form that we do not know what they are, but they know that that is the indication of sex magic and ritual being performed now. Think about what I just said. I look at the world in a more different way than a lot of people. I believe everything comes back to the beginning. Whatever these beings are, they don't want to say they're angels or demons, but I'm going to tell you right now, good guys, don't cut your skin and cut sigils into it. These are interdimensional beings. Something ripped with the Philadelphia experiment, with Jack Parsons, and they've been pushing this over and over again for a lot of years. There are entire CIA documents about how to conjure, how to try to control these entities. Believe it or not, there's a ton of information about this out there. There are documents out there. There's a company called End Time Productions. They make videos, and they'll provide the paperwork. They'll show you where it's at. They'll pull up the documents. They'll give you the data. Check it out if you want to. But we know the CIA has been looking at this. Hitler was looking at this. This is not new. There were leaders forever who've been trying to figure out how to manage this and make it work for them. Evil's evil, bad is bad. And if they need bodies and they can't birth them, but we can, we're useful to them. There are literally dozens upon dozens upon dozens of serious researchers who have come to the same conclusions independently, that whatever these things are, they're interdimensional, they're not extraterrestrial, they are here, they're literally laying right above us. And we know now, the scientists will even admit, there are multiple dimensions. And we just, well, at least we in the public don't think we know how to ride them. But what if arcane knowledge is what's been being traded to those who protect these beings while they go about doing whatever it is they need to do to keep themselves moving? Sounds dark, it sounds crazy, but I can give you another 100 stories, like the story of that priest, like the stories that Nathaniel gathers, like the stories that John Keel had, like the stories that many other researchers have had, including stories where these beings fled in exorcisms at the name of Christ. See, John Keel was a really scientific dude. He didn't set out to go into that direction. He was drugged there kicking and screaming. Many of these researchers were, and none of it ever made it to you because the Hollywood always tells you the same story over and over again. Magical beings in vehicles of light coming from outer space that are smarter than we are, that are better than we are. They give these magical messages about peace, light, and harmony. They don't talk about them stealing babies. They don't talk about people being impregnated and raped. They don't talk about any of that other stuff. Or if they do, they still couch it in they're still from outer space, and they must know what they're doing. And they're gathering our DNA like we do that for animals in the wild. That's much more logical. Except you can't explain to me why the sigils were cut on the inside of his eyelids, or of her eyelids. You can't tell me how they have found them cut into the skin of human beings. This isn't aliens from outer space. This is magic. Sex magic, ritual magic. It's old as time. It comes from before Solomon, although he dictated and practiced a lot of it in his lifetime. Started out a really good guy. He got into a lot of really nasty stuff later on. I won't go into the books of Solomon. They're dark. But this is old stuff. And it's lurking under the surface everywhere we are. And we've just been taught to not look. You want to hear more about stuff like this? Let me know. If you want to go back to ghost stories because they're fun, let me know that too. But these are experts in the field, coming from everything from hard science to theology, and all coming to the same conclusion. And I cannot be the paranormalist and not tell you the truth. This is what I truly believe. And it's been believed since the 1960s, but you never hear it anywhere. So see the pretty shiny object over here? Don't look at the pretty shiny object sitting back here. That's always been the government's game. That's always been religion's game. That's been the game of politicians forever, and anybody in power. But I think the thing that's sitting over here is the thing they need to learn about. With that said, I hope you didn't watch this right before you went to bed. Good night.